welcome back to the Fascinating Jobs podcast. I'm your host, Mackenzie Wilson. On this episode of the podcast, I'm sitting down with Diana Wink, author of the Prometheus dystopian trilogy, blogger, and storytelling teacher. Today we're getting an inside look into what it's like writing a fiction series as part 2 of our Creative Careers series. As always, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen so that way we can grow our community. With that, let's get into episode number 8 with Diana. So, hi Diana, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have you on this episode.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited too. I really look forward to that.
Awesome. So, how did you decide that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I think it's kind of cheesy to say, but I think like many writers feel the same, that you always knew that you wanted to be a writer. But I actually started writing when I was a kid, and I wrote short stories and poems and all that kind of stuff. And I knew I loved story for a long time, but then I kind of pivoted away from it and studied filmmaking. And I studied film directing and went into film, but I quickly realized that with film stuff is a little bit more complicated because you cannot realize every story idea you have, because you need to have the budget for it, you need to have the crew for it, and whatever you have in your head, it's not always on the screen because you didn't have like the possibilities to bring it to the screen, especially because of budget and money. So I decided I just wanted to be more creative in that respect and went back to writing, kind of back to the roots, and started writing novels. And yeah, that's how I got into writing, basically.
Wow, that's super interesting. Yeah, and I think that you definitely make a good point there, that when you're writing and you can kind of like self-publish and kind of like have your own ideas and you can be in control the entire time. So kind of along those lines, how do you get ideas for like books and then kind of plot lines?
Yeah, so I think the ideas are basically everywhere. It's kind of difficult to say that this is my process of getting ideas. I think every writer has a lot of ideas they're carrying around with them, and you most of the time you're bursting with ideas and you don't know which one to pick first to write about. I think the problem is not with getting ideas, but with making something from these ideas, because everybody has ideas, but writing them down and making a good, coherent, and well-written story is the difficult part, I'd say. So yeah, everybody has a book idea, basically. Everybody I ask, they're like, oh, I have the idea to write this book and that book, but the difficult part begins when you actually start writing.
Absolutely. So how do you kind of like pick what ideas to eventually make into a book?
I think before I went into, because I do self-publish my books, and before I went into this business side of writing with self-publishing, I just kind of went with my guts, with the idea that just like was the most interesting to me, the one that I felt I should write about, the one that I felt the strongest to me. Now I also think about the market. I think about how could I package this idea? Is this something that will sell? Is this something that will have an audience at all? Or will this be an idea that is really, really difficult to sell because there's no market for it? So I kind of go from both sides, one from the creative side, but the other one also from the business side, about thinking like which idea will most likely resonate with my fans, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's something that you might not realize when you're just like a reader. But so when you're writing the first book in a series, do you write it with a second book in mind, or how does that work?
So I actually just finished my first series, so I don't know how I will do it like with the second one. With the first one, I just went in and I had no clue how it would play out. I just planned every book, but I didn't plan like the whole series. And when I finally started like planning my third book, because it's a trilogy, I was kind of surprised of how this series ended myself. I didn't expect it to end that way, but I think this is like every writer has their own process, but having this kind of like wonder of discovery in writing, I think, is also like the fun part in writing, basically. If you don't know how it ends when you start, I think it's difficult to just go in and don't know anything about anything, so you just sit down and you have this blank page and you start writing. This is not who I am. I know that several writers do it that way, like Stephen King. He just goes in, he never plans anything. But for me, I need to kind of have like a rough plan at least. I need to know where I'm going. I need to know the goals. But discovering like the small things and the endings and how the characters will play out, this is also the fun part in all of it.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think as a reader, one of the questions that I've always had is like, how do the writers like keep track of all the tiny plot lines and like tie the books together so well into like a perfect series?
I think most of it is done in the editing actually. So you write that first rough, messy draft, and then you go in and you start cleaning it up. Basically, you start looking out for the plot lines, looking out for character development, looking out for the stuff that is probably not logical and not coherent, and then you work on it. You I think a normal writer does like 5 to 10 editing passes at least, and you edit yourself. Then you go in with the editor, and then you go in with some beta readers, and you edit and edit and edit until you kind of make something out of it that feels logical and good. So a lot of work goes into what feels like easy and flowing writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's super interesting because as a reader, you don't necessarily understand like how much actually work goes into the book. So from start to finish, like how long would you say that generally takes to like write and then publish the book?
Oh, I think it definitely depends. So it depends actually on the writer and their process. It depends on how much research, for example, you put into your books. So I think there are writers, they write a book every 3 to 4 months, which is crazy to me. And then it depends on which book it is. Like the first book, normally your very first book will take you years, but once you have figured out your own process, and like every next book normally takes a little bit shorter because you already know your process, you already know how to go into that book. But still, I like to take my time. I think for me it takes maybe a year, maybe a little less. I'd love to write 2 books a year, but I still haven't figured out how to do that because I just love doing my research and it takes me so long to do that research. And I love traveling actually to discover the locations of my books and so on. And it takes a lot of time, but I still love it. So, yeah, I hope I can be a little bit quicker and learn from those who like hit hit out a book every 3 to 4 months, which is crazy.
Yeah, that is kind of crazy, and especially with all the effort that goes into that, they must just stay up all night, like writing.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, what's your favorite part of the book process?
I think there's several of them. I love, like I said before, I love research. I love when you have like this rough idea and you form it into a story. I love plotting. I love sitting down and thinking about my characters and all these kind of things. What I really, really despise is the first draft. It's like my kryptonite. I just have to push through it. I don't know. It's kind of difficult. I discovered for me that dictating actually helps me a lot to get through the process. So I just sometimes I type, but sometimes I also dictate and then transcribe the dictation. Uh, and then there's editing, which I love again because you just go in like with a logical mind a little bit. You go in with your knowledge of the storytelling craft, and you form from, like I said, from this messy something that you just wrote down, you start forming something really, really great.
Wow, yeah, I think that's really interesting. So, just kind of like quick side question, what are some cool places you've gone to do research for books?
Yeah, so my trilogy actually plays on like in Britain. And what I did with the first book before I published it, it actually helped me a lot because I rewrote it like nearly completely after I did the travel. I followed the footsteps of my hero, who went from Scotland, from the Scottish Highlands down to Wales and Lake District, all the way down to London. And I kind of went myself. I went to all of those places and traveled all like this whole journey, And it helped me so much because it made my book so much more vivid, and it made it come alive, and it also helped me with many ideas. And then what I did, like I said, I just nearly rewrote the whole thing after that, and I realized it's so important, if you can, to travel to those places that you write in.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's so cool how you kind of like followed like the exact like order how you thought your book would go, and I think that's so cool. Yeah, so you were mentioning that you also like love the editing process. So how do you generally approach the editing process?
Well, I give myself a break, first of all, and I try to distance myself a little bit from the manuscript, and then maybe it's a week or two. And then I sit down and read the whole thing, and I just try to read it like a reader would, and just comment on it. I comment on the good things, on the bad things, on the things that I find not logical, on every idea, just like freely leave comments. And then try to structure my comments into how what things that I need to change. For example, I have like a whole sheet where I have like character changes, location changes, description changes, plot changes, and so on. Stuff that I need to research more about, and then I try to do it like systematically and go in. It depends on the book, actually. Sometimes I do it chronologically, sometimes I do it systematically and go in to just change the characters and just change this kind of theme line and so on. It depends on the book and on how rough the draft actually is. And after that, I usually let it sit for a week or two again, and then I print it out, and then I do what writers call a print run, which is you read the printed book and you comment on the printed book, because there's still a difference between reading it on your computer and printing it out and reading it on an actual piece of paper, and it gives you another perspective somehow. And after that, I do another editing run, and then I send it off to my editor mostly. And he does this like developmental editing, which we call, and it's his story editing basically. So the editor goes through the story and says, okay, I like that, I don't like that, here you need to work on, there you need to work on. Then again, I do the rewrites, and then I send it off to the editor again, who does the line edit, which is stylistic. Like he goes into the miniature stuff like style, language, grammar, and so on, and sometimes still comments a little bit on the story. And by that point, I normally send it off to some beta readers who will do another pass for me and just send me their thoughts, what they liked, what they didn't like, maybe some ideas. And sometimes it's really, really helpful because you've been so deep into this story, in that story, that you don't see it like with fresh eyes. So it's so good to have readers who have fresh eyes on that. Yeah, and then it's another edit, and sometimes I just go through with the book, and I put it into Pro Writing Aid, which is like a program that still detects some misspellings, grammatical stuff that you just miss in all those passes, and your editor misses as well, because we're all human. Yeah, and that's about it then.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that seems like quite a long process, but I think that it's really interesting how you kind of like first go through all the story and then like the grammar and something that gets done completely last. Yeah, so you were talking about like how you like have your kind of like sheet of characters, and so when you're writing the book, do you write the plot first and then fill in the characters, or do you start with the characters and then fill in the plot?
I think you cannot separate the two of them, because plot and characters, uh, they they feed into each other. So your characters need to have a goal, and from that goal, from them being active and doing stuff, comes your plot. And then you think, okay, I need to have this plot line, and maybe I need this obstacle, but it depends on how your characters react. So it's all like the story is both plot and character at the same time, and trying to separate them will actually make your story weaker, because your plot has to be character driven, always character driven, but at the same time you cannot like allow your plot to be too slow, so you have to watch out for both at the same time basically.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that definitely makes a lot of sense now that you've like explained it and everything. Yeah, so Kind of another part of the book is kind of like the cover art. So how do you kind of approach that?
Well, I have some ideas, but I don't do the covers myself. I always ask a designer to do it because I don't think I want to do it, and I think a designer will do it like much better. I want it to be professional, so I just give out my ideas. I give out some inspiration. I show him like some covers that I like. And then the designer starts his work, and I have an amazing designer and illustrator who actually lives in Portugal, but we communicate like remotely. And yeah, he's just great, and he gives me some suggestions, and I email him back and say, okay, this was good, this can be changed. But I love this involvement in the creative process, even with the cover design, and this is like one of the best parts of being a self-publisher, that you get a say in the cover art, which if you're publishing with a publishing house, you have no say at all as an author about what the cover looks like. But at the same time, it's a huge responsibility because the cover is actually purely marketing, and you still let yourself be influenced by your personal feelings and your personal taste, which you actually cannot, because you have to think about the market. And this is, of course, great if you're publishing with a publishing house. They do the thinking about the market for you, so all of your personal feelings are left out.
Yeah. And I think that's super interesting way to look at the cover art as like a form of marketing, which I feel like we don't necessarily realize, but like it is like a real form of marketing. Yeah, so
Yeah, sure. It's a package, because everybody says like don't judge the book by its cover, but this is actually, I think it's nonsense, because we all judge the book by its cover. If we try to pick a book, the first thing we look out for, I think it's normal because we're visual, it's the cover. And if we don't like the cover, we might not even pick the book up. So the cover is actually really important for the selling part.
yeah, that is really interesting. So you mentioned a few times that you self-publish your books. So could you maybe tell our listeners who don't know that much about publishing about like what the self-publishing process entails?
Yeah, so I think there are many myths with the self-publishing process, and many think, okay, writers who do self-publishing are those who couldn't get an agent or a publishing house to publish them, which is not true. I decided like I wanted to self-publish from the beginning, so when it was a conscious decision, and I didn't even try to get an agent or a publishing house to do that. Why? Because unless you're Stephen King, it's really difficult to make a living with writing only if you are published by a publishing house, because normally all the middle-list authors who are, like I said, not Stephen King or I don't know, yeah, all of those famous writers like yeah, it's quite difficult, and most of them actually have day jobs. And I really want to live with my writing. I want to make a living writing, basically. And with that, for that, self-publishing is really good because it's realistic. If you keep writing and you keep evolving, but you have to know the market, you have to consider it a business, basically, because this is what the publishing house does. And if you don't have one, if you don't have a publisher, you have to be the publisher and think about the business. But I like that. I like the business side of it. I like the marketing side of it. I struggled with it for a while, and I thought, okay, I don't want to do the marketing. I just want to write my books. But now that I understand marketing and understand its power and understand how actually creative it is, I enjoy both. And I really am glad that I get to do that.
Yeah, wow, that's very interesting. And I think that's kind of cool how you're just like a one woman show with a book. So, how did you kind of learn about the business side and the marketing side of the book publishing process?
Oh, I think it's really easy nowadays if you want to learn, because there's so many like great teachers out there. It's like Mark Dawson with the self-publishing school, David Cochran about book marketing, Joanna Penn with the creative pen, all of those. Like if you're in that business, you know those names. And they have great books, great courses, blog posts, podcasts, everything you need to know about that. But you have to be willing to dive into that and immerse yourself with that and learn and try things out. And it's a process. It takes, I would say, it takes years until you get the hang of that. It takes years of practice and learning and actually trying things out. Yeah, but there's lots and lots of material and resources out there to learn by now.
Oh yeah, that is very interesting, and I think that's one of the great like wonders of the internet is that you can really learn anything. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I know in a previous episode, I also had a girl who wrote a book, and she said that her like favorite part of it was kind of like getting the book at the end and just being able to see like your work into a real book. So do you kind of like assimilate with that feeling, or how's like
Well, yeah, it's really cool, but I'd say my favorite part was not that. It's really good to see that book and feel it in your hands, but the favorite part is when you start getting feedback from your readers, actually, from actual readers who leave reviews or email you and tell you how they loved the book and what they loved about it, because then it comes to life and you feel like you have like you found your tribe and you found those people who like it and that it resonates with people. And I think this is like the best part of it, that okay, I just haven't, it's not that I have written it but nobody wants to read it, but it's that I managed to entertain people and pull them into the story. And yeah, I think that's actually my favorite part.
yeah, that is really interesting, and that does seem like super cool to kind of like because I feel like each book series kind of has its own like little community around it, and fan fiction and fan art and all that kind of stuff. So, do you ever take like fan input in any of your books?
Yeah, sure. I try to really have a connection with my readers. I have a mailing list that people can subscribe to, and I email my readers regularly. Also, with personal stuff, with behind the scenes stuff, with videos that I make on my research journeys, for example, with stuff that I like, books that I read, and I try to connect with them. And I always answer fan mail. I love talking to my readers, and sometimes they have great ideas. Sometimes they uh, yes, and like I said, I have a team of beta readers which like read my books and give me input on that. Um, I just love connecting with my readers. I think this is really the best part of being an author, that you're not alone and that you know that your books resonate.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So, just kind of following up on the readers thing, I know that like if you're in like English class or kind of if you're a student right now, I'm sure you might relate to this where teachers will often ask like what's the theme of the book or like what's the like big picture message. So I have to know as an author, do you guys like write the books with a big theme in mind, or is this something that just kind of gets like maybe like made up or thought of in a classroom after you've already written the book?
Well, I think every author thinks about theme. Every good author thinks about theme all the time. But the process is different. Like again, I have to mention Stephen King because he has such an interesting process, and he never thinks about theme when he writes his first draft. He like kind of let it just he just writes and see what emerges from it. But afterwards, in the editing process, he thinks about theme a lot. I love to think about theme from the beginning on. I love to, but theme for me is actually, and I love this approach. I learned it from another writer who said it's a question that you need answered as well. A general question about life, a general question that bugs you and that you need answered as well as your reader. And you kind of take your reader on a journey with you to answer that question. And you don't always know the answer beforehand. Sometimes it just emerges in the story. And this is quite powerful, I think, because story actually is always about change. It's about change of the character, but it's also about change inside of us and inside of our readers. And like reliving this change while writing, I think this is like the most authentic part of it, because when it touched you, when the book did something with you, it will also do something with your reader when he reads it or she.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's super interesting how, yeah, like you kind of maybe think about it, but not as much as we are in school. So how could maybe a high school or college student who wants to kind of like be a novelist, how could they learn more or practice, writing?
Well, first of all, I'm just gonna throw it out there. I have like a homepage. It's called storyartist.me, where I teach people all about storytelling because it's such a passion of mine. I think storytelling in every form is able to change the world, even if it's a small world around us. Yeah, and I'd say just learn. There are two parts to that: learn the craft and practice. So start learning the craft of storytelling. It's so important. Don't ever sit down before in front of a white sheet, a blank page, and think, okay, I'm just going to sit down and write, because you will fail. You will absolutely fail. After the first 2 pages, or maybe the first 20 pages, you will be like, okay, I don't know what to do right now. So learn the craft, learn from other writers what they're doing, what their process is, how to write a good character, how to write a good plot. Know your craft like every other craft, actually, everything you do, like an engineer, I'd say, just learn this craft. And on the other hand, sit down and try writing and apply this craft, because when you start applying it, this is where the magic happens. Yeah, so do both things. Yeah, and you might actually fall in love with it.
Yeah, of course. So how did you kind of like discover your own writing process?
By writing. So you start writing and then you hit a wall, and then you say to yourself, okay, what do I do now? I have to navigate around it. I have to see what I can do. Yeah, and then you do stuff and learn from it, and it's like trial and error until you get it right. And every book that you write helps you improve your process. I'd say it's not perfect yet, but improve it. Learn about yourself and learn what's the best thing for yourself. And like with every season of life, I think your process will change as well. Yeah, I think it's just pure practice basically, and also maybe learning from others. So there are tricks from other writers that you can learn, writing sprints, how they deal with the blank page and so on. You just can take their experiences and try and apply them to your life and see what happens.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think that's just kind of like something that like might seem so obvious, but I like the way that you explain it, how just kind of like a trial and error with the different writing techniques and all sorts of things. So, do you have any, if you can think of any, do you have any like book recommendations that you would say that like if you want to write a book, like this is a good, sample book to look at, or?
Yeah, sure. So the three story method is really great because it's all about the basics, by Jay Thorne. Uh, it's all about the basics of storytelling, like the rough basics. Then there's Anatomy of Story. It's really good, but it's about the details, about getting into the details, about the writing process. There are several books, but it's a bit difficult. I have so many of them. I have like 20 or 30 books on my shelf about storytelling. There are so many. Just Google storytelling on Amazon and you will get so many great books on that. And with something I just have to mention, on my website, there's also the Storyteller's Blueprint, which you can get for free. And it's also like about the basics of storytelling, but also about how to perfect your writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that's a great place to start on your website, and yeah, I think that you mentioned lots of great titles. So, what's like a difference that you've noticed in like teaching other people how to find like their writing process or how to storytell versus like how doing it yourself?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit difficult because everybody has their own process, and you can't teach only that much, and from then on it's their responsibility to actually do stuff, because writing is so organic and so based on experience and so based on personal preference. Um, but what I like to do is just share my own experiences with that, share my own insights, and see if that helps people. Because I know from my own experience that other writers have helped me, but I never like fully adapted everything they say. I take stuff and then I adapt it, like I try to merge it into my own life. and this is what I try to do for others, hoping that my experiences will help them get there faster.
Yeah, I think that's like a good way to approach it because writing, I feel like, is so subjective, and like you mentioned, everybody kind of has their own way of looking at it. So it's a kind of important to just like, take in like what you think could be of most of highest value to yourself.
Well, I just like to add that storytelling has its laws and it's a craft and it's something you can learn actually.
Mm-hmm.
But the process in itself is something that every writer has to write for himself. There are like rules. Uh, I would even go as far as saying you cannot break them because if you do, your story will not be a good story. So there are basics you have to know and you have to learn. But how you do it, like how you write your book, how you structure that process, because it's an incredibly creative process. This is all about you and how you want to do it. But again, here you can also learn from the masters and from all the writers out there because they have so many insanely great tips that will help you get there faster.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, could you give us maybe like an example of one of the storytelling rules?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of them. I think I mentioned several of them already. Like, story is change. So, this is like one of the most important things. Your character cannot remain the same as he was before. And I know that there are stories that not don't focus on change that much. Let's take all of those action-packed stories, James Bond and so on. I mean, James Bond is practically the same guy he was at the beginning of the movie or the book as he is at the ending. But these are not powerful stories, I'd say. These are not stories that stick with you. This is nothing that is highly original. And there's still some kind of small change going on in the character, even a tiny one. So, story and change is really important. Story driven by character is really important. So, everything that happens in the story has to be actively induced by the character. You cannot have all the time stuff happen to him or her and he just always reacts but does is always passive. This will make a really boring story. Yeah, this is really important. Then you have like this three act structure, which can be applied to every good story. And then the theme, the story has to have a theme, but the theme needs to be underlying. So it cannot be something that like is preached all the time because the reader will see through it. It has to be in the actions, and I think this is one of like the most important ones, and people hear it probably all the times, but I still say it, it's show don't tell. And if you get this principle, your stories will become really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I agree. It's show don't tell. I've definitely heard that one before, but I think that it's so important because it's one of those things that when it's done well, like it's done extremely well, and the story turns out just fantastic.
Yeah, you just have to get it. Show don't tell is really difficult to execute because it yeah, it requires a lot of work from you. And if you do lazy storytelling, there's a lot of telling and not much of showing. But if you're willing to put in the work, it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what is some advice that you'd give to new authors who are just starting out?
Well, I'd say first of all, decide why you're writing. Do you want it to be a career? Do you just write for fun? And for yourself, is it some? And I'd say every form of writing is valid. So don't feel like you have to do it as a career just because. Do whatever you want to and how you want to do it. It can be maybe therapeutic. It can be just for you, and that's fine as well. Decide why you're doing it because this why will take you through the difficult times of writing because every writer hits a wall every now and then. Every creative person hits the wall that can be an imposter syndrome, that can be I don't know what to do with this blank piece of paper. This is really bad. My story is not moving forward, and so on. And the why will get you through that. So decide why you're doing it and then move on from there. If you're doing it, if you want to do it professionally, if you want to make a living with that, um, you of course have to approach it completely differently. You have to be really serious about that. I also do have a podcast, and on that podcast I interviewed Yu Howie. I don't know if you know Yu Howie, the one of the biggest names in self-publishing, who published the Wool trilogy. And he said like he worked full time in a bookshop, and he got up early in the morning and wrote for like 1 or 2 hours. During his lunch break, he wrote, and in the evening after work, he wrote for 2 or 3 hours. And this he did every single day. So it takes a lot of diligence and it takes a lot of work to make it as a writer. But if you love it, it's absolutely worth it. Um, and then you, of course, approach it like also from the business point of view, like we mentioned with self-publishing and so on. Even if you don't want to self-publish, you have to think about marketing and business. And if you just do it for fun, yeah, just try to get your hands on some books on storytelling, read about this, and sit down, try to write, try to see if it's something for you, try to see if it's something you like, and maybe you will consider it as a career if you fall in love with it.
Oh, yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's like a good tip for all new writers. So I think that just about wraps up our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining me. I had a wonderful time talking with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it as well a lot.
No problem, and thank you for answering all of my reader questions.
Yeah, you're welcome.
A special thanks to Diana for joining me today. You can check out her website for her books, www.dfwink.com/Prometheus Rising, her website and blog, www.storyartist.me, or her podcast, The Story Artist Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out this podcast on our website, www.fascinatingjobs.xyz, or Instagram at fascinating_jobs_pod, or Twitter at fascinatingjobs. Tag me with questions or comments, and be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to this podcast to let us know you're enjoying it. And if you or someone you know has a fascinating job, email us at fascinatingjobspod@gmail.com for a chance to be a guest on the show. Thank you so much for listening and enjoying this podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode.